If you're watching this and you're a UK citizen, then I'm here to tell you that your country needs you. Britain is just days away from one of the most important elections in our lifetime to decide our country's future.
We will have a general election on the 4th of July.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm!
While it's funny to think July 4th might mark the UK's own sort of Independence Day from the Conservatives, it is not a done deal. The next government is still in flux, and you have the power to help shape it. But how did we get here? I've spent weeks researching the last 14 years of Tory rule, looking at the major failings of the Conservative government and the Prime Ministers leading them. So without further ado, let's wind the clocks back 14 years. The year is 2010, and after a hard-fought campaign against an increasingly unpopular Labour Party, Conservatives have secured the most seats, but still not enough to form an outright majority. While Labour had been dealing with the 2008 financial crash and were marred by their role in the Iraq War years earlier, the Conservatives were still known as the Nasty Party and desperately needed a change to their public image. The man to achieve this, in their eyes at least, was David Cameron. Coming from aristocratic privilege and wealth, Cameron attended elitist private schools like Eton College before going on to be educated at Oxford, becoming a member of the private all-male Bullingdon Club, which has a history best summarised as wealthy members, sexism and other bad behaviours. Members included George Osborne and Boris Johnson, who was actually around at the same time as Cameron, and they became best friends who lived happily ever after and never stabbed each other in the back. Probably. But after becoming Tory leader, David was able to present himself as an everyman, despite his extremely wealthy background. The work to revitalise and modernise his party meant to move away from its right-wing image. Gone were the tired faces of old Tory ministers, and in their place was a relatively young leader and cabinet, ready to bring the Conservatives into the 21st century. But despite the party facelift, Cameron still didn't have enough to form a majority in power, needing to rely on the Liberal Democrats led by Nick Clegg, a man who broke most of his promises, reduced the Lib Dems to a laughingstock, before leaving to do PR for Facebook. He seems great, but hey, the Tories had done the impossible and were back in power. So how would they use their position to help the average? In October 2010, George Osborne, former Bullingdon Club member and at the time Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced the Conservatives' 5-year austerity plan, something the UK is still struggling to recover from. To give a brief overview, austerity is used to help reduce the national debt, and can be in the form of tax increases, spending cuts, or a mix of the two. After the financial crash, it was clear some level of austerity was needed. While Labour had planned to tax the top 5% earners a bit more, with smaller cuts to spending, the Tories had other ideas. Rather than taxing the rich, Osborne actually lowered taxes for top earners, but still wanted more aggressive austerity measures, leading to public services like the NHS having their budgets cut to pieces. Rather than the most wealthy being taxed a bit more, the poorest had welfare reduced while the media demonised them, and up to 500,000 people working in the public sector lost their jobs. In the case of the NHS though, it was more than just a cut in funding. In 2012, Jeremy Hunt became Health Minister, and the NHS still hasn't recovered from it. Under his watch, junior doctors went on strike for the first time in 40 years, and patients being seen within 4 hours went from 94.9% all the way down to 84%. Later in 2017, Hunt's idea to address this was to ban people walking into A&E.
Oh, it's just that my huge stressful problem is I'm bleeding out of my asshole.
He wanted to make people cool instead, so that frontline workers would be tied up with patients on the phone rather than patients in the hospital who were, where they needed to be. Hunt also reduced capacity by 8,000 hospital beds, leading to hospitals becoming crowded more often, greater risk of infections, cancelled operations, and guaranteed stress to NHS workers. I'm going to move on before I explode, as I haven't been guaranteed a hospital bed, but just know this is far from an exhaustive list, and there are videos and articles down below if you want to learn more. In an effort to be so short-sighted Specsavers would take pity on them, Cameron's government also sold off major parts of British industry. The big one was the British steel industry, with Tata Steel being sold, putting thousands of jobs at risk. Even ARM, an incredibly influential chip manufacturer, had their sale approved to the Japanese company SoftBank, with the co-founder remarking,
"This is a sad day for me, and a sad day for technology in Britain. ARM is the last British company that has a global reach. It gave Britain strength. It was a British company that determined the next generation microprocessor architecture."
But despite this, the UK government chose not to block the sale. Repeatedly, the Tories have chosen the short-term gain over the long-term benefits, taking the money in the present while kicking the problems down the road. Problems like, I don't know, taking money away from replacing aging concrete and hoping someone else will deal with the collapsing buildings down the line. But hey, what a weird hypothetical to bring up out of nowhere. Anyway, one problem Cameron had been continuously kicking into the long grass were the people on the right of his party who wanted to leave the European Union, a trade bloc of countries allowing convenient travel, scientific collaboration, and ease of imports. Now you might be thinking, wow, that sounds great. I mean, it's pretty rough around the edges, but who would want to leave that? Who would leave that? Why did we leave that? During the 2015 election, over fears of losing Conservative voters to UKIP or the unstable kooks within Impotency Party, David Cameron announced there'd be a British exit referendum if he was elected again. And after beating out his Labour rival Ed Miliband, he was left in the awkward position of having to honour his word. To make matters worse, after announcing a referendum at a time the country wasn't ready for, and tying himself firmly to the Remain side of the debate, his best friend for life who absolutely would never stab him in the back, Boris Johnson, broke off their friendship while stabbing Cameron in the back. Cameron might have been using the fear of the unknown to try and bolster the Remain campaign, but Boris Johnson and co were free to make up whatever they wanted about the EU, with Johnson talking bananas. About literal bananas.
How many directives have you passed on bananas? How many
don't
have they got?
go to the bananas.
Essential? Are they all essential for
Boris,
us?
the bananas are not your strongest suit.
Most infamously was the Brexit bus, claiming that by leaving the EU, we could fund the NHS again, after Jeremy Hunt tried to murder it. I guess different strokes for different folks, and deceitful stories for lying Tories. Also in the mix were UKIP, who were trying to frame it as a vote around immigration, and Dominic Cummings, who was leading the charge behind the scenes. This whole situation, to be blunt, was a mess, and with many people uncertain about what they were actually voting for, the referendum ended with Leave winning by 51.9% of the vote. David Cameron was in a difficult position. Having led the Remain campaign, he now needed to lead a party and country he'd helped divide. However, despite the hardships, he continued to persevere as party leader. No, just kidding, he immediately left. David Cameron's time as Prime Minister was a dark period in UK history, and while there are some legitimately good things he managed to achieve, such as fighting for gay marriage to be legalised, there are also too many problems to talk about. I've tried my best to give a summary, but I've had to leave out a bunch of stuff here, like the war in Syria, the Panama Papers, and the refugee crisis among others. David Cameron had left a legacy, albeit one he probably didn't want, and whoever replaced him had the difficult job of dealing with the mess he'd made. Before I talk about our next Prime Minister, if you like what you've heard so far, please help me out by leaving a like so YouTube pushes the video out to more people, and if you want to hear what I talk about next, maybe even subscribe. But hey, back to the car crash. With Dodgy Dave bailing on the country towards the end of 2016, the Conservative Party had the unfavourable job of trying to replace him, at a time when everyone knew the job would be impossible to get right. Naturally, this meant Brutus wannabe Boris was interested in running, backed by his bestest friend forever, Michael Gove, who immediately stabbed him in the back by rubbishing Johnson and announcing his own bid for leadership. For everyone watching on, this was very funny, but it was clear that neither of these men could be trusted to run the country, and you'd have to be crazy to elect one of them as Prime Minister. So I'm glad we avoided that timeline. Anyway, the person to attempt this difficult task was Theresa May.
Strong and stable. The strong and stable leadership.
A long-serving Conservative who was pushing for a more honest and selfless party as early as 2002. In a conference speech she gave at the time, she talked about how the Conservatives were still known as the Nasty Party, and this was an image they needed to shake through compassion and reaching out to all areas of society. A speech contrasting the government she ran from 2016 onwards. Theresa May had been a Remainer, but wasn't tied to it in the same way as David Cameron, allowing her to lead the Brexit talks for a divided party and country, at least for a time. The issue was, groups like the European Research Group and other factions within the Conservative Party had been veering to the right, embodying more extreme views and demanding a harsh exit from the EU that would throw the country into turmoil. May was an unelected Prime Minister, and with these extreme factions, she was constantly walking on thin ice. She attempted to keep the public on side, despite the bitter division exposed by Brexit, while also having to appease the right-wing factions threatening to oust her if they didn't get their way. May might have been the one at the wheel, but the car was driving itself, and it was heading for the nearest cliff it could find. Theresa also found herself struggling with incidents like Grenfell, where a large tower of flats caught fire, and due to the lack of fire safety measures, 72 people were killed, partly due to the government having faulty guidance with lax regulation. Her opposition proved to be the greater issue though. Jeremy Corbyn is a rather polarising character, and not really a person we have time to cover fully, but at the time he was seen by the public as more down to earth than May. He criticised her response over Grenfell, as well as her handling of the Windrush scandal, where Commonwealth citizens who had been given indefinite leave to remain in the UK in 1971 hadn't had any records kept on them to determine who was allowed to stay, leading to migrants predominantly from Jamaica and other Caribbean islands being either wrongly deported or threatened with deportation. I've linked some articles down below for people who want to know more. While Corbyn was a somewhat outspoken figure, he'd mustered massive support from younger voters. And when Theresa May called a snap election in an attempt to ward off the right of her party, Corbyn was a large factor that led to her minority government. Admittedly, Theresa's personal anecdotes didn't help either.
I have to confess, when me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat, the farmers weren't too pleased about that.
The thin ice May had been navigating was beginning to crack beneath her, but she continued to try and deliver Brexit, coming up with a deal which wasn't good, but was likely the best the UK was going to be given under the circumstances. The staunch Brexiteers weren't having any of it though, claiming the agreement was too soft. By attempting to maintain ties with the EU, she faced multiple resignations among her own party from the likes of, Boris Johnson. He gets around a bit, showing a lack of confidence in her leadership. After a series of continual rejections for her Brexit plan and surviving 2 votes of no confidence, in May 2019, Theresa May announced her resignation as Prime Minister. Despite standing down, she didn't run away from politics like David Cameron did. She's continued to work for her constituents as a backbencher. May was actively sabotaged, with her own party setting her up to fail. But with her exit, it's important to look back at that speech she gave way back in 2002.
There's a lot we need to do in this party of ours. Our base is too narrow, and so, occasionally, are our sympathies. You know what some people call us, the nasty party.
Theresa May ended up campaigning in the same way as the people she once criticised, painting all politicians with the same brushstroke and using public apathy as a tool, in many ways using the exact method she once criticised. But in the end, the nasty party she warned against was the very thing that ousted her, and with the last moderate Conservative out of the way, the inmates were running the asylum. After May's resignation, Boris Johnson was elected Prime Minister. The former mayor was known for getting caught on a zip wire, Boris bikes, and being a serial adulterer, which lucky for us, Boris took a break from, in favour of screwing the country instead. He got fired as a journalist for The Times after he was found lying, before becoming Mayor of London, where he refined the image of a buffoon that he'd employ as Prime Minister. His caricature of an unkempt, blundering politician was darkly brilliant. After public outcry towards a comment Johnson had made about women in burqas looking like letterboxes, a sentence that feels fake even though I remember it happening, Johnson walks out of his house with mugs of tea for the press.
I have nothing to say about this matter except to offer you some tea. Okay.
Johnson seemed able to weather any form of critique with his charisma and bluster, no matter the severity of the actions he'd taken. But that can only work for so long, especially when all eyes are on you. We've already touched on the little fibs Boris had a part in telling during the Brexit vote, but there's also something during his time as Foreign Secretary worth noting. During Theresa May's time as Prime Minister, there was an attack on the UK in Salisbury, with Russia believed to be the culprit. A nerve agent was used to attack a former Russian intelligence officer, leading NATO to hold talks about Russia. Johnson, the Foreign Secretary at the time, slipped away from the meetings with NATO and his own security detail to attend a party in Italy at a venue owned by former KGB agent Alexander Lebedev. If the name Lebedev sounds familiar, by the way, it might be because his son Evgeny Lebedev was controversially made a lord by Boris Johnson. Weird, right? But hey, I'm sure he had great reasons for that. After all, he's proven himself to be very trustworthy. Back to the downward spiral of Johnson's time as Prime Minister though. After being an obnoxious critic of Theresa May's Brexit deal, Boris made the bold and controversial decision to get a worse deal. Amazing. His version largely resembled May's, with a few differences, making his outrage to her plans prior feel like a rather transparent power grab to take her place. It was too late for reflection though, as a battered, broken Brexit deal was waved around as a victory. And Johnson not only calling a snap election in December 2019, but managing to win a majority of 365 seats, dealing a major blow to Labour's Jeremy Corbyn. Although, given the timing of that election, the morale boost didn't last too long. In March 2020, the UK was sent spiralling due to the coronavirus pandemic. What started as a warning about unnecessary travel and a cheery message of turning the tide in 12 weeks quickly became a countrywide lockdown. The government early on wasn't exactly acting on scientific advice though. Among contradictory public health messaging and being generally slow to act, Johnson's government were initially entertaining letting the virus spread to generate a herd immunity, completely overlooking what the death toll would have to be to achieve this goal. By the time Boris acted in March, the pandemic had already hit, and it was far too little too late. Around this time, there was a lot of praise for the NHS, with Johnson even describing it as the beating heart of the country, despite the Tories' previous attempts to stomp the life out of it. But while saying it was powered by love was nice, and people clapped in the evenings, so there's that, there was nothing done to prop up the health service that was barely standing by this point. NHS staff were overworked, traumatized with death on an unprecedented scale, and had been putting their lives on the line without the proper safety equipment. But it was okay, because according to Johnson, it was never overwhelmed and was powered by love. I mean, you could have put effort into actually providing them with functioning PPE, but thoughts and prayers work too, I guess, Boris. I've linked a statement by the British Medical Association down below, and I highly recommend reading it. It gives a harrowing account of Johnson's conduct during the pandemic and describes the kind of person he is far better than I ever could. Adding insult to injury though, the government prioritised public mood over people's safety multiple times. As early as June 2020, the UK was already trying to get people back into schools, offices, and other type cramped spaces where viruses can easily spread. On top of this, Johnson's Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, announced an Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Something to apparently stimulate the economy by getting people to go into public spaces during a global pandemic. This kind of stupidity is rather typical of Rishi, but don't worry, we'll get very well acquainted with him in a bit. By October, there was already another lockdown, with restrictions over Christmas being announced, for everyone except for Tory MPs apparently. The first COVID vaccine was approved during December 2020, and yet by March 2021, the UK had 86,000 COVID-related deaths, one of the worst death tolls in the world. The vaccine rollout had been largely successful, but there had been a massive toll taken on the country. And the story wasn't over yet. Conservatives have been giving friends of the party personal protective equipment contracts through a VIP fast lane, leading to faulty, unusable equipment and a shortage of money. The most public example was Michelle Mone, who had links to a company given more than $200 million in government funding for masks and surgical gowns. The gowns had to be discarded for not being up to standard, while her husband was paid £65 million from the company's profits. There were also cases of Johnson's own government breaking the rules they had put in place. Chief Advisor Dominic Cummings, responsible for widespread chaos during the Brexit campaign, took a trip from London to County Durham during the peak of lockdown. He also took a trip to Barnard Castle, which he claimed was to test if he could drive after having problems with eyesight. Not sure why he didn't try just reading a book instead of dangerous driving with obscured vision, but to each their own. The other person to touch on is Matt Hancock. Matt had the competence and charisma of a damp sponge, which wasn't great for a health secretary during a global pandemic, especially when he's caught breaking social distancing rules and cheating on his wife at the same time. Come to think of it, maybe that's why Boris liked him. A man after his own heart, in more ways than one it would seem, as towards the end of 2021, the Partygate scandal came to light. In November 2021, reports the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet had parties despite their own social distancing rules came to light. Johnson initially insisted that guidelines had been followed, at all times. But every time it looked like Boris could relax, his bluster and unintelligible mutterings warding off stories of one lockdown party, another would be discovered. As pictures began to emerge, showing Johnson present at some of the parties, it became very clear that he'd actively misled Parliament. Reports of invites telling people to bring their own booze started making the rounds, which feels a bit cheap. Like, come on Boris, at least provide the alcohol for your illicit gathering. Could have had a whole speakeasy theme going. At least it would set the theme for an illegal party. As more information came out, the sheer number of lockdown parties was staggering, with Johnson having attended a gathering as early as May 2020, just 2 months after lockdown began. Many parties were around November and the Christmas period. But while people were forced into isolation by the government, Boris and co broke their own rules, partying at a time when the country was at a breaking point and the NHS was on its knees. Based on what we know currently, there were at least 16 parties that took place. While Johnson was telling the country they needed to lock down, both Boris and Rishi Sunak were issued fines for breaking their own laws and attending illegal gatherings at Downing Street. The final nail in the saga was a report from civil servant Sue Gray, who detailed in June 2022 the full extent of the excessive drinking and inappropriate nature of the gatherings. Partygate majorly shifted not just public perception, but how conservatives viewed Johnson. The party had gone from being a cult of personality, betting on him to win, to seeing him as a liability. With rampant inflation, a struggling NHS, and over 119,000 people dead by the end of June 2022, the deck was stacked against Johnson's chaotic leadership. And yet, despite everything, it initially seemed like Boris would survive the scandal. He somehow survived a vote of no confidence in June, and it looked like his incompetence and lack of care had been rewarded yet again. Johnson carried on as Prime Minister, despite the new Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer's unrelenting questions, and his own party's unease. But only a couple weeks later, a range of scandals led to the Tories losing 2 by-elections. We haven't really talked about it, but there were numerous Conservative MPs facing allegations of sexual misconduct, further damaging the party's reputation. One such case was Chris Pincher, a Tory whip with a long history of allegations of sexual assault and misconduct. Johnson initially claimed to have no awareness of the allegations before Pincher's appointment, only for the story to change, to Johnson having forgotten about it. Pincher's conduct was a poorly kept secret though. Some Tories even openly joked about it, with the phrase "Pincher by name, Pincher by nature" coming to light. And this would be the final straw for Johnson's government, with Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak resigning from his cabinet in protest. This led to a very funny couple days in government where practically everyone was resigning. 60 MPs resigned in the end, although Boris still had time to fire Michael Gove, which I really can't blame him for. Finally, on the 7th of July, Johnson stepped down, his luck of outrunning the scandals he'd caused seemingly running out. Almost a year later, in June of 2023, the Privileges Committee determined Johnson had deliberately misled Parliament during the Partygate scandal, their report seemingly the final nail in Johnson's coffin, with him resigning as an MP the day the report was published. Looking back at the Johnson years, there's almost too many scandals to cover. When researching this, there were entire incidents I'd forgot happened due to how much was going wrong at the time. Johnson's grasp over the Conservative Party had transformed it. By getting rid of politicians like Theresa May, he gave groups like the ERG greater control than ever before, leading the party to veer more to the right than they had been in decades. Johnson had always been a populist, but his time as Prime Minister led to weaponising sensitive subjects in an attempt to capitalise and combat perceived woke issues, such as Black Lives Matter, LGBT rights, trans rights in particular, and of course immigration, where from the outside looking in, it appeared that cruelty was the point. But with Johnson gone, the Conservatives had the job of finding yet another Prime Minister. But things couldn't get any worse. Right? After Johnson imploded, the Tories were left with the fallout, and the 2 main candidates to fill the void were a right-wing millionaire accused of cashing in on the 2008 financial crash, who had a campaign page ready 6 months before Johnson was even gone, and a vegetable. Okay, that's unfair. The lettuce actually beat her, but for 49 days, Liz Truss was Prime Minister, seemingly as a joke, but the UK economy was the punchline. Her time as Prime Minister started with the Queen dying a couple days later. Seemingly Truss becoming Prime Minister was the final straw. Okay, so Liz didn't exactly have the best luck, which Liz I'm talking about is up to you, but things would only get worse from here. Not long after, Truss and her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, launched a high-growth, low-tax mini-budget. This genius plan included a £45 billion tax cut that was completely unfunded, with money stolen from an imaginary leprechaun probably. The financial markets weren't let in on the magic pot of gold though, and as a result, the pound plummeted, mortgages skyrocketed, and government borrowing rose, with the Bank of England having to bail them out by buying government debt. In response, Truss owned up to it, issuing a statement, claiming no, she just blamed Kwarteng for everything and fired him. Stepping in to replace him as Chancellor was Jeremy Bain, of the NHS hunt, who reversed everything Truss had done. Liz had managed to mess up so badly that despite the fact a Conservative Prime Minister is technically protected for their first year from internal attempts to oust them, they were considering changing their own policies to get rid of her. After just 49 days as Prime Minister, Truss resigned, becoming the shortest serving in British history. When looking back at her time in office, and the seismic waves she caused, one thing becomes very apparent. The lettuce absolutely would have been a better Prime Minister. With Liz taking a swift exit, the loser of the last leadership race was fast-tracked to Prime Minister. If there's one thing to know about Rishi Sunak, it's that he is incredibly wealthy. The most recent figures place his personal wealth when combined with his wife at £651 million. Interestingly up by 122 million from 2023, which is funny given everyone else is struggling under a cost of living crisis.
I have friends who are aristocrats, I have friends who are upper class, I have friends who are, working class, but I'm not working class.
When at Oxford, Sunak had opposed Labour's introduction of a minimum wage, and went on to be part of a small team of hedge fund bosses who loaded the Bank of Scotland with crippling debt, leading to a financial crash that majorly impacted millions of people, while Rishi became a multi-millionaire.
Billions of pounds of taxpayers' money, while Rishi went to California to count his coins.
Sunak was a hardline Eurosceptic, which makes sense when you're rich enough not to feel the consequences, but for a while, he was able to avoid this perception of wealth as Chancellor under Johnson. While schemes like Eat Out to Help Out caused problems down the line, with experts pointing to it as a factor for the major COVID spike in autumn 2020, at the time it was very popular with the public, and Rishi looked like a competent leader compared to the blundering idiot in charge.
Peppa Pig world.
This didn't last long though, due to his incredibly wealthy wife avoiding UK tax on overseas income, and being fined for attending some of the lockdown parties. He also cut the £20 a week uplift to universal credit, putting younger people at risk of homelessness. A couple weeks earlier he'd been applying for planning permission for his indoor swimming pool. I guess you could say he made quite the splash. Also, while campaigning against the vegetable, Sunak boasted to constituents of Tunbridge Wells that during his time as Chancellor, he'd taken money from deprived urban areas to give to wealthy towns instead.
Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, then that needed to be undone.
How good of him. During his time as Prime Minister, he's negotiated a framework to regulate trade through Northern Ireland to the EU, which he called privileged access, until people pointed out that until Brexit, the whole UK had that. He's failed to meet most of his 5 pledges, and his time as leader has been dominated by attempts to seemingly be as cruel as unnecessarily possible to people seeking asylum. Given how Brexit was framed as taking back control of borders we already controlled, Conservatives were becoming more extreme with their rhetoric. Under Johnson, Home Secretary Priti Patel, who voted against marriage for same-sex couples in 2013, was known for her tough stance on immigration, as she promised to make small boat crossings unviable by forcing dinghies back to France instead, a policy criticised for making people spend more time in France, and a change to immigration policy to refuse admission if people had a connection to a safe third world country. Whatever that means. Most notably though, Priti oversaw the start of the Rwanda asylum plan, where people the UK claimed to be illegal immigrants or asylum seekers would be relocated to Rwanda, despite claims of Rwanda's human rights violations. She'd never see her work prosper though, as multiple court cases fought over the legality of the bill, and after reports of bullying, toxicity and breaking the ministerial code, Priti Patel was out and Suella Braverman was in, proving that even when things look like they can't get any worse, they in fact can. And by quite a lot actually. Braverman was seen as somehow more extreme than Patel, saying homeless tents were a lifestyle choice, labelling pro-Palestinian protesters as hate marchers, and describing migrants coming to the UK as an invasion. She's a somewhat controversial figure. Braverman was a constant thorn in the side of Sunak, and yet for a long period couldn't be ousted. Sunak had lost popularity within his own party, needed the support of more extreme groups to stay in control. This went brilliantly, as illustrated by the time Suella Braverman undermined Sunak at the National Conservative Conference, with some seeing it as her bid to become the new Tory leader. To cover every controversy Suella has been a part of would take longer than talking about every mistake the Conservatives made over the last 14 years, of which an hour would have just been reading Boris Johnson's name repeatedly with different effects over it.
Boris Johnson.
So the highlights are that the Rwanda plan was a twisted passion project for her that didn't really go anywhere, with the closest they got being to put a bunch of asylum seekers on a barge that had a Legionella outbreak and with crowded conditions that MPs believed could be a human rights violation, all because they didn't want to give hotels to asylum seekers. After the peace marches by pro-Palestine groups on Remembrance Day 2023 that Braverman called hate marches and tried to insinuate that the organisers were linked to Hamas, Braverman was finally ousted as Home Secretary after going behind Sunak's back on an article accusing the police of being biased.
Something that many people would agree with, but not in the way she means.
Something that had not been approved by the government that she did anyway. But with the crisis of replacing her on his hands, Sunak performed the greatest achievement of his political career by bringing back a more successful Prime Minister. David Cameron's return as an unelected member of cabinet grabbed headlines and left Braverman in the dust. But while it gave Cameron a chance to amend his legacy, Sunak was still treading water. When he's supposed to be working to help the country recover from the damage he had a hand in causing, he's instead talking to people like Elon Musk. Maybe he can get a job at Twitter after the election. It's about as alive as his political career anyway. I could continue on about Tory MPs like Matt Hancock and Kwasi Kwarteng agreeing to help further the interests of a fake company set up by Led by Donkeys, who have the footage on their YouTube page, but I actually want to close out with a smaller controversy. Under Sunak, there was an issue with a type of concrete, called Raac, that was used in buildings from the 1950s to the 90s. It was very cheap, but had a lifespan between 30 and 50 years before needing replacing. Now you might be wondering, haven't I heard this already? Problems like, I don't know, taking money away from replacing aging concrete and hoping someone else will deal with the collapsing buildings down the line. But hey, what a weird hypothetical to bring up out of nowhere. The Cameron government's inaction at the time, betting on someone else taking the fall, had finally come around. Those austerity measures I talked about back then are still having an impact to this day, and in the case of Raac, something preventable with proper funds was allowed to go unchecked until schools literally began to collapse. Sunak's time as leader has been marked with inaction, extreme rhetoric, and culture wars. But while Raac wasn't the biggest scandal, to me there couldn't be a more fitting metaphor for the past 14 years. The Conservatives kick problems down the road, hoping the roof will cave in on someone else's government. They have short-term, attention-grabbing policies that often either don't fix or actively worsen the problem, before passing their time bomb onto someone else, blaming them for problems the Tories caused. This has been the cycle since Cameron was Prime Minister. So, after 14 years, with the next general election right around the corner, when they promised the world, do you believe them? I was just a kid when the 2008 financial crash happened. I remember listening to the radio during a car journey, talking about how 2009 would be a bad year, and having no context to how someone could predict that. Before I was in secondary school, the coalition had gone into power. There has been a Conservative government for almost as long as I can remember, and when Brexit rolled around, I was too young to vote. The future of our country got decided while my generation could only watch from the sidelines. But now, it's time for everyone who can vote to make their voices heard. This video is a lot shorter than I would have liked. I started working on it as soon as the election was announced, but 7 weeks isn't really enough time for me to record and edit everything I would have liked to. But after everything I was able to cover here, I hope it helps give a clearer image of who the Conservatives are. In the coming weeks, there are going to be many vapid claims made. As I'm writing this, Sunak talked about mandating national service for people age 18, and claimed the Treasury had found Labour's plans caused a £2,000 tax rise, a claim disputed by the Treasury, who stated there were costings beyond those published by the Treasury, and figures from other sources shouldn't be presented as if they were produced by the civil service. Also, Labour hadn't revealed its plans at the time. So there's that. These are the most notable ones while I'm writing this, but Sunak is desperate and will say anything, especially given he's likely not going to be empowered to act on it. I bet Cameron envies him. As I stated before though, this is not a done deal. Even if Sunak loses, if the election is closer than expected, with the Conservatives keeping many of their seats, not only will it prevent the next government from making meaningful change, it also allows the cycle to repeat. Change is not going to come quickly. Rebuilding the country is going to take a while. But if progress is slower because the damage is greater, people tend to have short memories. And the problems of the past 14 years might be distant enough that they might give the Conservatives another go at breaking the UK all over again in 5 years' time. And who exactly will be leading them? Current favourites to replace Sunak include Kemi Badenoch, Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, and Harold Saxon, who seems like a pretty moderate candidate. But jokes aside, is that really going to be a government for the people? To prevent this damned future, we need to think differently about this election. Rather than being pro-Labour, pro-Green, or pro-Lib Dem, we need to unite under the banner of being anti-Tory. Using tactical voting, we can unite under the candidate with the best chance of beating the Conservative in a given area, attempting to maximise the seats lost by Sunak and his cronies to make sure the last 14 years don't repeat down the line. To achieve this, I've linked sites like stopthetories.vote, where you can enter your postcode and it will let you know which candidate is most likely to beat your local Tory. And this is my call to action. Make sure you're registered to vote, you've got a valid ID, and when July 4th rolls around, put your postcode into stopthetories.vote. Find your candidate and vote tactically to reject everything the Conservatives represent. We've got a real opportunity here to make a difference. So, if you're watching and are a UK citizen, your country needs you on July 4th. So let's vote to show them what we think.
The Prime Minister has had responsibility for the UK economy now for 1,323 days, and he's delivered. He's delivered the largest national peacetime debt ever, the largest tax burden since the Second World War, the highest core inflation since 1991, the fastest interest rate rises since 1989, and the biggest fall in living standards in our history. So will he stop lecturing my constituents about holding their nerve, ditch the lame excuses, and admit that he is literally the worst person to be leading this country through a cost of living crisis?
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This has been one of the most difficult videos I've ever had to make, given how little time there was between the announcement and election date, but I really felt like I needed to talk about it, so I hope you've enjoyed. I'm still planning on making the Alan Wake video. I was halfway through a script for the game Indica before Rishi announced the election, messing up all my plans, which I think was very inconsiderate of him, frankly. If you liked the video, help me out by leaving a like so YouTube pushes it out to more people, and maybe even subscribe. Also, if there's something you'd like to hear me talk about at some point, leave a comment down below. I do read them, so let me know what you think. But hey, I've been Banquo, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in a bit.